Hello students, Mr. Jen here with Chapter 17, Lesson 5. Basically, the war is coming to a close in today's lesson. The epic but tragic tale of the American Civil War comes to an end today. We've learned that the tide of war turned after Gettysburg, and today we see how that plays out with the last Union commander, Ulysses S. Grant. There he is, Grant and Lee. All right, by 1864, the Confederacy was pretty much surrounded. The Union blockade of the ocean had been in place for some time, and Grant, with some help in the West, had basically secured the Mississippi River. So Anaconda Plan was coming to fruition. All that was left was to take the southern capital at Richmond, Virginia. Here's the old Anaconda Plan. So Grant had been an average student. He had failed at business and farming. However, he'd always been a very good horseman, and it turns out a very great general. By this point in the war, he had proved himself perhaps the most capable general in the Union. That is why Lincoln made him the commander of all Union forces in March of 1864. Grant would set about marching on Richmond, while General William Tecumseh Sherman drove his army like a spear through the Deep South. So Grant would move on Richmond in a series of battles with Robert E. Lee. The first was called the Battle of the Wilderness. The fighting was basically a bloody close-quarter struggle in woods that were sometimes so thick you could barely see each other. The Union outnumbered the Confederates, not quite 2-1. I think it was like 100 to 60,000, something like that. Both sides, of course, suffered heavy casualties, but the Union won, forcing Lee to withdraw. Next up were some more actions at Spotsylvania and Cold Harbor. In these battles, Grant lost 50,000 men. Back home, he was called the Butcher for these losses, but he kept pressing forward. The South was losing men too, basically men they could not afford to lose. The Union had a lot higher population. They could afford to lose a lot more men. The Confederacy couldn't. Basically, what they had was it. There were no reinforcements. Continuing to press on after Spotsylvania and Cold Harbor, Grant moved on Petersburg, which was a vital railroad center of the Confederacy. Basically, if Petersburg fell, the war was over because Richmond would be cut off from the rest of the South. Talk about cutting the head off the snake. Now, General Sherman and his Union Army were in Georgia, so the Deep South, trying to take the city of Atlanta. Atlanta was defended by a group of rebels under the leadership of General John Hood, who's often been described as a tactical genius, a very capable general. I was stationed in Fort Hood in Texas, which is named for General John Hood. Sherman just essentially faced major resistance. That city was a hard one to win, but eventually the Union did take the city of Atlanta on September 1st. The mood in the South by this point was becoming desperate. Meanwhile, a Union naval fleet under the command of David Farragut captured the last Confederate port, Mobile Bay, in Alabama. Farragut is best known for the quote below, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." So we swore in class. That's all right. It's a historical quote. Okay, that brings us to the election of 1864. By 1864, we'd been in the Civil War for a while. Lincoln was president, and remember, they started the war. Not everyone agreed with it. There was like a very loud voice in the North that wanted the war to end. So Lincoln didn't seem very popular. Running against him in this presidential election of 1864 was one of those generals he fired, General McClellan. Well, as it turns out, McClellan got his butt kicked. Lincoln won 55% of the popular vote. But the important thing is the electoral votes. He took all of them but 12. You can see on the map down here. See, it looks like McClellan won Kentucky and New Jersey. That's it. So, with Lincoln as president, everyone knew that the Civil War would continue. It was a voice of the people. They said to continue it. It was also interpreted as sort of a mandate, if you will, that the American people were ready to end slavery once and for all. Therefore, on January 31st, 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed, ending slavery officially in the United States. Not the Confederacy yet. That brings us to the end of the war. After 9 months of fighting, Lee had to abandon Petersburg. Richmond was now doomed. Meanwhile, the South fought on. Sherman adopted a new strategy called total war to break the will of the South. His army basically marched towards the sea from Atlanta and then headed up north to meet Grant's force up by Richmond, and the whole way they destroyed anything that could be considered useful to the South. The idea was to basically break everyone. They burned down farms, destroyed crops, killed livestock, burned cities, all of it. They destroyed everything. This controversial movement, this maneuver, if you will, is called Sherman's March to the Sea. It's pretty famous historically. They just destroyed everything. The people of the South were, of course, outraged. The slaves, however, were thrilled. They basically followed the army when they heard it was coming. They had escaped from running the army for protection and just followed them along their trail. There you have it. The March to the Sea. They destroyed rail line, what little rail line the South had. Lee abandoned Petersburg to Grant on April 2nd of 1865. Grant and his forces seized Petersburg and moved on Richmond. When the Confederate leadership found out that Petersburg had fallen, they basically packed up and ran because they knew that the Union was coming. That includes Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy. Lincoln and his son actually went to Richmond to visit, and it's said that he was sitting in a rocker in Jefferson Davis's house when he was asked what to do, what they were going to do with all the Confederate soldiers. And he said, well, I'd let them up easy. Let them up easy. He was feeling merciful. He was feeling merciful. And indeed, we'll talk about the terms at Appomattox. With the southern capital taken, the war was all but over. Lee still had his army, but it was battered and hungry. He had thought about continuing to fight, but the Union Army captured his train of supplies with food, so his men were hungry. They were surrounded, and so Grant had sent a letter to Lee that you should probably surrender. And he agreed at this point with his starving, battered army. And so Grant and Lee met at a small town called Appomattox Courthouse. They made small talk. Where's my Grant and my Lee? There they are. There we go. All right. They made small talk. Nice weather we're having. I like your uniform. And then Grant offered Lee what many considered generous terms. The officers could keep their sidearms, their pistols, which are usable. They're not major weapons of war. I can understand why he did that. They're sidearms, they're backup weapons, largely ceremonial. He also let any soldier in the Confederacy with a horse keep his horse, and he basically let all the men go home. So just turn in your rifles, turn in your cannons, keep your horse, keep your pistols if you have one, and just go home and no one will bother you. Just pack up and go. That is pretty generous. We'll talk about more implications later in the next chapter, things like restoring voting rights and stuff like that. But for now, just let the men pack up and go. He also, with Lee's army starving, they didn't have any food. He gave them food to feed his army. On the toll of war, the Civil War is the bloodiest war in American history. If you think about it, it was Americans versus Americans, just killing each other. So no one else died, just Americans. That's why it's the bloodiest war in history. The South, however, was a wreck. The Union was saved, but the South was physically a wreck. Sherman messed it up pretty good, and most of the fighting had been done in the South. The slaves were free, and it was obvious now that the federal government was stronger than the state governments. And there were a lot of unanswered questions on how to proceed now. What do we do now? But we'll get to that in the next chapter. We're talking Reconstruction. But on to your assignment. Tomorrow will be study day. The following day will be the war. But for today's assignment, I'm giving you an option again. If the page ever loads up. Just play with my men, I guess. This is taking a while. Well, I remember the questions. Option 1 was Do you think that Sherman's total war was essentially justified? So do you think they should have used total war? I mean, they destroyed everything in the South to get the will of them to break. There we go. All right, yes, the South was losing, but they refused to surrender. Sherman marched to the sea. Total war was used to destroy the will of not just the Confederate soldiers, but the Confederate people as well. They destroyed everything useful in the South that they came across. Do you think total war was justified, and why? That's one option. Option two, the terms Grant offered Lee at Appomattox Courthouse were seen as generous. The men just got to go home. They kept their horses. Officers kept their pistols. Do you think Grant should have been more harsh on Lee and his men, and why? So pick one of those questions and answer it. Remember, more is better. They sound like opinion questions, but your opinion must be backed up with actual facts of what we learned, so it will be a good indicator of whether or not you actually read the lesson. All right, that's it for today. We're finishing the Civil War in about 2 more days. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you tomorrow.